Isn't it fantastic when you just walk a few meters and suddenly everyone goes quiet? Thank you for being here. Welcome. My name's Andy Jackson. You're here at the State of the Writing Nation, which we were saying in the green room earlier today sounds huge, doesn't it? And it is huge. It's going to be a very special night. I've been looking forward to this very much. Thank you for joining us here in person, but also those of you who are listening via the live stream. Before we kick off, it's important that we remember and acknowledge again that this event takes place on the lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. Writers Victoria and the Wheeler Centre acknowledges them as traditional custodians and owners of the lands on which we meet. We pay respects to their elders, past and present. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And because we say these words quite often, I just want to take a couple of moments to let them sink in and invite all of us to, including myself, to reflect on how we could make that acknowledgement deeper and more genuine, how it might affect our lives and the way that we engage with the nation. I'm really looking forward to tonight, as I said. It is in honour of the Writers Victoria Fund. So those of you who have paid your entrance fee tonight or have donated via the live stream are helping to increase opportunities for writers who experience financial and social barriers to developing their writing skills, to engaging in workshops or taking other opportunities that Writers Victoria offers. So thank you for supporting them through this. Of course, there will be an opportunity if you're super keen tonight to make extra donations to the fund, but also there'll be an opportunity for you to buy books. Apart from that though, we're here tonight to hear from two very special writers. I'm very aware, I think, tonight that you don't want to hear too much from me. I want to hear from our two guest writers tonight. We'll hear the actual State of the Writing Nation address from Andre Dao later on tonight. But first up, we'll hear from Hasib Hirani. Both our writers tonight, this applies to both of them, but I think Hasib is a writer of, I think, great rigour and urgency and lucidity. They know the place from which they write. And both our writers tonight actually grapple with what language can do. They both make work that is potent and can change the way that we see the world and each other. Hasib Hirani is a Lebanese-Palestinian writer, editor, arts worker and educator living on unceded Wurundjeri country. He's a 2020 recipient of a Wheeler Centre Next Chapter scheme, and his essay, When We Blink, was shortlisted for the Liminal and Pantera Press Non-Fiction Prize and is published in their 2022 anthology Against Disappearance. Hasib's debut book will be published with Giramondo in April 2024, which is so exciting. Clear your diary around that time so that you can go to the launch. I just want to also say personally that I came upon their work through an incredible poem also published in Liminal called I Am Writing in Vignettes Because All We Have Are Fragments. So if you don't know that poem, look it up. It's astounding. So please make Hasib very welcome.
Hi everyone, thanks Andy for introducing me. I'd also like to extend that acknowledgement and centre specifically that the movement for First Nations justice is centred around land back and without that, we will never have sovereignty. I'd like to do things a little differently tonight. Words are insufficient without action. I was going to read a section of my book that speaks to this, but instead I'm going to talk to you about action. Art is inherently political. It's why some of the most prominent revolutionaries across Palestinian and Levantine history have also been painters, poets. Art is inherently political, and yet, in this undeniable moment of injustice, artists and arts organizations across the continent remain avoidant, abstaining from any kind of stance on Palestine. Why? If an organization or outlet is silent on Palestine, I implore you to look into its ownership, board of directors, and funders. More often than not, you'll find explicit ties to the Zionist project in Palestine, ties to families and foundations that 100 years ago and still, to this day, help realize the colonial dreams of Zionism in Palestine. I want you to think of Melbourne's most prominent arts festivals, theaters, and galleries. Who comes to mind? The same foundations that fund Victoria's biggest creative endeavors have also been funding the active colonization of my people's land for nearly 100 years. Today, they collaborate with the funds that ethnically cleanse and build settlements on stolen Palestinian land. They fund Israeli election campaigns and just last month justified war crimes in Gaza for capital and political gain. These foundations whitewash their complicity by giving money to the creative left. But my call to the creative left is not to let yourself be taken advantage of and weaponized. If a creative project relies on Zionist funding, that project is forever corrupted, whatever its contents. These foundations do not create the work or make it available to the public. We are the artists, the festivals, the literary institutions, the publishers, the galleries, and we cannot let our names be used as seals of approval for institutions that falsely posture as progressive. When these funders come knocking with their checkbooks, we can and must reject it. Don't subscribe to media outlets whose allegiance lies with the Zionist entity. Do your research before you apply for a grant or submit to an award. Reject funding if that funding is unethical. I'm an artist, a creative producer and editor. I know our sector is severely underfunded right now. I know how hard it is to secure funding in the first place. I know I'm asking for a great sacrifice from you tonight, but it is only a fraction of the sacrifice our Palestinian siblings are making for our collective liberation. Talk to people in the community. Talk to me. Ask for advice. How will you make your creative work ethical and just? We shouldn't still be asking for a ceasefire. The Australian Labor Party and its collaborators continually betray us, but we stand undefeated. Presence on the streets of Melbourne has tripled in just 1 month. We've seen RMIT cancel its partnership with Israeli arms manufacturer Elbit Systems. We've seen 9 countries and counting pull their ambassadors from Israel in protest. The global movement continues to prosper. I firmly believe that we will see a free Palestine in my lifetime. We just need you to know your power and to use it. Come to the rallies, call your MPs, follow BDS, refuse funding from complicit organizations and foundations. It's been an honor to witness historic moments of protest and boycott. I hope you've been a part of them, and if you haven't, it's never too late to start. It's not a lucky coincidence that I, a Palestinian writer, was programmed tonight. There is always something you can do to help platform Palestinian voices. Thank you, Andre, for asking me to share my work. I don't take this opportunity lightly. I'm going to end by reading you a very short excerpt from my upcoming book of poetry. It's taken from the final section and is about a boycott action that took place over 10 years ago now to protest the Gaza blockade, just like my peers across the globe are doing again right now. What is dawn good for? A beautiful cusp, a veil for construction, a lift for surprise. Gather at dawn. 500 gather at dawn, picket the port of Oakland, block a ship and its boxes. It's morning, then it's afternoon. Then it's 6 p.m. and still the ship floats bloated in the belly of the bay. Keep it heavy, massive. Leave it no choice but to spit up and spit out in glorious explosion in planes of non-existence. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. We can all think more and act more. Thank you. I want to introduce Andre Dao now, who is a Melbourne-based writer, editor, and artist. His debut novel, Anam, won the 2021 Victorian Premier's Literary Award for an unpublished manuscript. And I read it at that stage and was really stunned by its complexity, but also how clear and beautiful the writing was. Andre's writing has appeared in Meanjin, Sydney Review of Books, Griffith Review, so many literary journals, but also within publications such as the Saturday Paper and New Philosopher. He's also the co-founder of Behind the Wire, an award-winning oral history project which documents the stories of adults and children who have been imprisoned by the Australian government after seeking asylum in Australia. His work for Behind the Wire includes a Quill Award-winning article for the Saturday Paper and the Walkley Award-winning podcast, The Messenger. He co-edited Behind the Wire's collection of literary oral histories, They Cannot Take the Sky. It's a real honour to introduce Andre, and I'm looking forward to what he has to say. I know everyone who I mentioned that I was introducing Andre tonight was very excited. So thank you for putting aside the time for this, and yeah, please make him very welcome.
I too want to begin by acknowledging that I am speaking to you today on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I live and work on these lands too, as a settler, and in many ways my address tonight is part of an ongoing project of trying to reckon with that. Thank you to Writers Victoria and the Wheeler Centre for inviting me to give this address. It's a great honour and also rather daunting, in part because of the rather grandiose title, but mostly because I'm following in the wake of writers such as Jennifer Down, Alice Pung, Maria Tamarkin, Maxine Beneba-Clark and Tony Birch. I also want to thank Andy Jackson for his warm words of introduction, and thank you to Catherine McInnes and Sandhya Bahuja for so carefully reading earlier versions of tonight's speech. Finally, I want to thank Hasib Harani for opening. It is not for me to add to what Hasib has said, except to say that we should all be listening to voices such as Hasib's. We should be listening as well to voices such as that of Palestinian writer Adania Shibli. Her novel Minor Detail was supposed to be awarded the Liberatur Prize at last month's Frankfurt Book Fair before she was disinvited, with the war between Israel and Palestine cited as the reason. Speaking after the disinvitation, Shibli said that, in Palestine, Israel, I, like many others, grew up realizing language is not merely a tool for communication. It often hides rather than articulates, holding between its silence endless possibilities not concerned with expression. Language can be attacked, abused. It can still offer the ultimate freedom of being and love you don't have access to in reality. Shipley said that for 4 weeks after the start of the war, language deserted her. I now understand this loss of language, she said, as an outcome of staying with pain, the incomprehensible pain of those in Palestine, Israel, against whom a new degree of cruelty has been unleashed, the personal pain of the loss of a dream that we could dare to imagine a new form of togetherness, where we allow ourselves to learn from pain rather than unleash it against others. I'm particularly grateful to Hasib for reminding us tonight that art and literature are always political. And while Hasib focused on the material entanglement of art and politics, and especially of the effect of money and its sources on literature, I want tonight to take up a different thread. That is, the effect of literature on politics. I want to ask, following Shibley, how can we write in such a way that the writing offers us new forms of togetherness? All writing is an invitation to share something, an image, a mood, a story. In this sense, all writing helps to produce a community. The question is, what kind of literature will help to produce the kind of community we want to live in? The answer I give in this speech is that there are already many writers working today whose writing can help us think of better ways of living together. To draw out what these writers have in common, and to point forwards to the work still to be done, I will call this a minor literature. When I began to think of what I could say for this address, I kept catching on the title. What business do those two words have with each other side by side like that? Writing and nation. What is the relationship between writing, so often a lonely pursuit, and the nation, that slippery idea that is supposed to contain us all? And isn't there something missing here, something between writing and the nation? I'm reminded of a scene from Brian Castro's fictional autobiography, Shanghai Dancing, in which the narrator's mother, the daughter of a white English woman and a Chinese man, arrives in Australia and finds herself unable to speak. There was a time in Australia, writes Castro's narrator, when she couldn't even buy her lunch at the factory canteen in case she jumbled up her words. Instead of speaking, she takes to walking. Castro again. When she spoke of her days, all of her associations were with walking. If she kept on the move, she wouldn't be targeted. It was a race not to be targeted. I didn't tumble to it for many years. After she died, it all became clear. Her complex was bound with race. She couldn't use the word with this other meaning. She walked fast, ran when no one was looking, to get there first before the final clause was added. Sometimes I feel that I too have been on the move, as a writer and as a person, never stopping in case I get boxed in, targeted. I am building up slowly because it is far easier to not talk about race. I have avoided it even in my author bio. I am a writer based in Melbourne, not a Vietnamese Australian writer, not even an Australian writer. There is, after all, every reason to avoid bringing up race. By bringing up race, I risk being misread, put back in my place, told to go back to my place, or else I risk being patronised, invited to do more diversity work, to sit on more panels. It's all the more tempting not to bring up race because of the specific way in which racism largely functions in Australia, through the denial of its own existence. The campaign against the Voice referendum enjoined us to vote no to division. You see, it was the countless Indigenous leaders in First Nations-run organisations asking for a voice who were being divisive. The racist denial of racism works because it appeals to a formal equality that erases difference. In the case of the Voice referendum, those campaigning no could say that the equality of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples has already been guaranteed by the formal category of citizenship. To demand anything more would be special treatment. Indeed, to continue to talk of difference after citizenship is to be unequal, is to be divisive, is, in short, to be racist. We're all citizens, so why keep bringing up race? Similarly, to talk about race as a writer is to risk being accused of special pleading. Just as citizenship guarantees equality, doesn't being a writer guarantee a kind of literary equality? To bring up race is thus to be ungrateful. Playing the race card means you get what you deserve. Look, he did it to himself. How can he complain now about exoticization, about Orientalism, about ghettoization? And yet, if I'm going to talk about the nation, how can I not bring up race when it has been there from the very beginning? Race was written into the Australian Constitution in 1901 in the form of the race power which allowed the Commonwealth to make laws with respect to the people of any race for whom it is deemed necessary to make special laws. And in case there's any doubt about the purpose of this race power, let us recall that Sir John Forrest, then Premier of Western Australia, said, It is of no use for us to shut our eyes to the fact that there is a great feeling all over Australia against the introduction of coloured persons. It goes without saying that we do not like to talk about it, but still it is so. We do not like to talk about it. Even then at Federation, it was better for racism to operate quietly under erasure. For the first 2 years of the pandemic, alongside Sherry Huang and Michael Green, I spoke with some of the people who feed the nation. The people picking fruit and vegetables, processing meat, cooking and packaging for supermarkets and home delivery. And though they clearly perform essential work, these people had no clear pathway to staying here. They are, in the anemic language of the government, temporary migrant workers. They also happened, by and large, to have Asian and Pacific Islander bodies. Though these bodies feed the nation, they are not allowed to fully enter into it. The official policy is not framed in terms of race, but the way labour is classed as skilled and unskilled, the recruiting patterns of employers, the division of the world into zones of cheap and cheaper workers, all of this produces a racialised landscape and a hollow literature. 2 Taiwanese backpackers working in a meat processing factory on the Victorian coast spoke to us about shokako. They were trying to explain why they felt that their experience in Australia had been, overall, a positive one, despite having been paid a pittance to endure difficult and dangerous work conditions. They were glad that they had come to Australia, they said, because these hardships had changed them. This is when they used the word shokako, a word originally coined by the Japanese novelist Haruki Murakami to refer to the small but certain happinesses in life, tearing off bits of a freshly baked loaf of bread, or wearing a clean, fresh-smelling shirt. The term has become popular with young people in Taiwan who reject the life trajectory mapped out for them by older generations. Study, get a good job, get married, have children. And now these 2 young women were using shokako to explain what they had learnt while butchering lamb carcasses in Warrnambool. Stories like theirs, and words like shokako, are part of daily life on this continent. But what pathways do they have to fully enter into the national literature? If literature has a nemesis, writes Nam Lee in an essay on David Malouf, it is instrumentalism. The approach that treats literature as a tool values it not for its own sake, but as a means to an extrinsic end. Of course, he's right. There is something grotesque, even comical, about literature that is pressed too obviously into the service of something other than itself. This is perhaps most obvious when writing is conscripted in service of the nation. In 1999, John Howard and Les Murray co-authored a draft preamble to the Constitution to be put to the Australian people at the same time as the question of a republic. The now largely forgotten text was, according to Howard, an attempt to embrace in ageless language a sense of who we are, a sense of what we believe in, and a sense of what we aspire to achieve in the future. Despite the involvement of a celebrated poet, a national treasure, the result contained nonsensical lines. We value excellence as well as fairness, independence as dearly as mateship. You can laugh at that if you like. But there is something more insidious here than chauvinism. It has to do with Howard's twinned invocation of an ageless language that can express something essential about the Australian people. This is an attempt to use language which transcends, outside of history, outside of place, to speak an eternal we. This is the language of myth. Here we start to get to the heart of the relationship between literature and nation. For the nation is nothing more and nothing less than a community that has to be imagined into being. Nation building is the art of inducing a shared dream across otherwise heterogeneous people. Usually the myth of common origin will do, a common origin in blood and soil. Meanwhile, literature is always an invitation to a collective or shared imagining, even if that collective is no more than 2, writer and reader. There is, so long as the reading goes on, a kind of communion between 2 minds. There is a natural affinity then between the imagined community and that most potent form of communal imagining between nation and literature. Perhaps then the relationship between writing and nation is one of mutual service. The laureate apostrophizes national heroes and eulogizes departed leaders. The bard sings the life of the people, and the apologist brushes what needs to be forgotten under the carpet. In turn, the nation gives the writer a home, an industry, sometimes even a living. And if they're very good, or very lucky, or both, they become national writers. In this sense, national myth-making completes what force of arms begins. The so-called culture wars did not begin in the 1980s. There has always been a culture war, as a necessary corollary to the frontier war. In the beginning, the bare legal fiction of terra nullius had to be supplemented with more comprehensive fictions of an empty land, or at least a land as good as empty. And there has been no greater nor more useful fiction in this respect than race. Of course, human difference is real, but the differences between us are myriad and potentially trivial. Race, like gender and class and sexuality, is a socially constructed system for organizing and classifying human differences into hierarchies. That is, for making certain differences matter. Literature itself is part of this racial hierarchization, acting as a proxy for cruder signifiers such as skin color. Literature is a powerful index of civilization, of cultural sophistication. And so the history of literature written in the English language in and about this continent is the history of a language trying to make its home in a foreign, inhospitable landscape. This is the history of attempts at writing the great Australian novel, of trying to create a European national literature on the far side of the world. Once the nation has its own literature, the settlers will truly belong here, and the dispossession of the world's longest continuing cultures will have been completed. When the Nobel Prize Committee awarded Patrick White, they said that he had introduced a new continent to literature. So much presumed ownership was attributed in that one sentence. Indeed, the greatest achievement of Australian literature is to have settled these lands through language and imagination, as surely as through law and state and crown. The Howard Murray preamble is suffused with this national myth-making. It begins by declaring that Australia is constituted by the equal sovereignty of all its citizens. Then, the Australian nation is woven together of people from many ancestries and arrivals. This is a claim to unity, a unity based on sameness against and despite difference. But even in this brief preamble, a threatening difference is always waiting to burst through. There is the difference produced by mass migration, acknowledged and neutralized in the line, in every generation immigrants have brought great enrichment to our nation's life. And there is the difference produced by colonization, tacitly recognized and dismissed when the preamble refers to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as Australia's original inhabitants, and not as custodians or owners, as Indigenous leaders had been demanding. Right at the very end of the preamble, when it ought to be at its most triumphant, the mythical unity conjured by ageless language is preemptively defensive. The equal dignity of Australians, we are told, may never be infringed by fashion or ideology nor invoked against achievement. A reflex salvo in the culture wars. In a condensed, ridiculous fashion then, this preamble does what the greats of Australian literature try to do, to make the nation's unity real. But the preamble was a failure, both in literary terms and politically. After all, more Australians voted against the preamble than against the Republic, something for which I think we can all be grateful. It seems fairly obvious that so wholly to instrumentalize literature, to make it serve another master, such as the nation, is to kill it. But can literature serve itself? One way forward is suggested by Lee in his essay on Maloof. That way forward is sovereignty. Not the sovereignty of the nation state, but in Lee's words, sovereignty of a different kind, personal, artistic, closer in spirit to Bartleby's I Would Prefer Not To, or Stephen Daedalus's Non Serviam. There is something attractive about this image of the writer as sovereign, as the one who will not serve. First, because it upholds a precious vision of artistic freedom. And second, because it promises a kind of ideal reading, one in which the writing can be read on its own terms. To be read as a writer, and not as representative of anything or anyone else. That must be the chief desire of any serious writer. And yet the spectre of race haunts this image of the sovereign writer. At a literary festival this year, on a panel discussion on the politics of the book review, the conversation turned to recent local controversies about race and literary criticism. At this point, one of the panelists, Ramona Cavall, a former host of Radio National's The Book Show, compared attempts by editors to increase the racial diversity of their book reviewers with flipping through colour swatches from Dulux. Cavall then suggested that such affirmative action was totalitarian. I don't tell this story to single out Cavall. I can think of many other examples, including that of Lionel Shriver's speech at the Brisbane Writers' Festival, decrying the way identity politics constrained her writerly freedom, or Richard Flanagan's defence of Shriver, in which he worried that writers' festivals now run the risk of running with dogma, with orthodoxy, with the mob, with fear. In fact, both these examples were addressed already on this stage in Tony Birch's inaugural State of the Writing Nation. The point is not to take offence, but to show how artistic sovereignty ends up constructing an idea of literature that has to be defended in much the same way that the nation state has to be defended. To be a sovereign artist is to plant a flag, build a fence and say, "This is mine." And to say that this is mine is to already assume an attack, more specifically, an attack from outside. It's why talk of home slides into talk of fortresses, of something that must be defended, perhaps violently. Pauline Hanson's Swamped Bay Asian speech in 1996 included the analogy, "If I can invite whom I want into my home, then I should have the right to have a say in who comes into my country." For the sovereign writer, the fortress to be defended is not the mythical nation, but instead a mythical self. This mythical self is deracinated, either without origins at all, or else with roots that don't particularly matter. Nothing about where they've come from can be said to constrain their writerly freedom. This mythical self is, in other words, the universal writer, with a capital W, the one who writes, miraculously, from nowhere and with no history. Like the nation state, this mythical self has to be defended from difference. Diversity programs, the movement for own voices in storytelling, sensitivity readers, all of this infringes on the freedom of the sovereign writer to imagine who and what they please. Not because any of these measures actually stops a Cavall or Shriver or Flanagan from saying and writing whatever they like and being published and broadcast in the process, but because every assertion of racial difference threatens the myth of the universal writer. Anthropologist Ghassan Haj has said of those who are always worrying about the nation, those people who are always saying that the place is going to the dogs, that their pathological worry is that of people who use worrying to try to instruct themselves as the most worthy Australians in the land. Nobody cares but us real Australians. That's why we are worried and others aren't. In the same way, an insistence on artistic sovereignty can end up producing an idea of literature that is exclusionary by default. For a Cavall or a Shriver or a Flanagan, worrying about the freedom to write whatever they like makes them the most worthy writers. They are the only ones who really care about true, that is, deracinated literature. Those others who talk about race are concerned with politics or political correctness or dogma or Dulux colour charts. At any rate, they are concerned with something other than literature. But in a nation where racism largely operates through its own denial, the separation of literature and politics becomes, at best, complicity. For one thing, deracination is more readily available to some writers than others. As Haj has noted, those worrying about the Australian nation are invariably white. So too those who declaim most loudly the sovereignty of their individual imaginations. Indeed, the similarity between the myth of the sovereign writer and the myth of the sovereign nation can be so strong that the two start to run together. As Lee shows in his essay, for all that Maloof intends on going his own way, he has also been engaged in a half-century campaign for cultural nationalism, self-consciously revisiting each major event in the myth of the Australian nation, from settlement through to the First World War and beyond. In Lee's words, Maloof has been engaged in his own sedulous, stupendous project of nation writing. I am reminded too that Les Murray liked to contrast serious poetry, including his own, which he called whole speak, with narrow speak, the language of journalism, politics, and economics. There could be no more sovereign poet of the last century than Murray. Yet he and his collaborator, John Howard, an adept at narrow speak, if there ever was one, turned to ageless language, to whole speak, to mythologize the nation. An understandable response to the extreme deracination of the sovereign writer is to turn back to roots. This is to give up on any meaningful we across the Australian continent. Rather than an Australian literature, there would be a series of ever more specific hyphenations. Refugee literature, Vietnamese Australian refugee literature, Vietnamese Melbourne refugee literature, Catholic Vietnamese Eastern Suburban Melbourne University educated refugee background literature. I'm glad that got a laugh. Of course, that is a caricature of identity politics, but then the politics of identity, of representation, is so ripe for caricature. Even leaving aside bad faith critiques, the problem with identity as a basis for literature is that it leaves the identified in a double bind. On the one hand, much needed sustenance can form around specific identities. It can produce good writing too. Not writing in translation for a dominant culture produces a different kind of freedom and constraint. The freedom and constraint of writing for a knowing audience, which challenges writers to push beyond established scenarios and motifs and to develop afresh their literary voices. On the other hand, identity can quickly slide into essentialism. This can manifest as a stifling concern with authenticity, a freezing in place and time of culture. Whereas the writer with a capital W can innovate and move forward, the authentically ethnic writer must remain faithful to the fantasy of a pure, originary tradition. Essentialism can manifest as ghettoization, when elected affinities become expected, even compulsory. So what had started out as liberating becomes a straitjacket. Naturally, to get out, the ethnic writer demands transcendence and universality, demands to be read for their craft, demands sovereignty. And then we're back to where we began. Since the publication of my novel, I have come to realize that this bind, or the effort of trying to escape it, drives the book. The title, Anam, refers to an imagined nation, one half remembered and half dreamed by the survivors of the 30-year conflict in what we now call Vietnam. In the novel, my narrator rejects this nation and its mythmakers, the Anamites. The past, he thinks, is not a home. In fact, he rejects all homes, all belonging. He prefers to be a stranger, lest, like the Anamites, he becomes complicit in the exclusionary violence of community. And yet this rootless unbelonging is never wholly satisfactory. He wants to give something more to his daughter. But what could that be? My wager in this address is that there is something worth salvaging in artistic sovereignty, perhaps even in the idea of nation itself. It is worth remembering that the nation, at least before it becomes the nation state, has historically had revolutionary, resistant force. One might think here of national liberation movements in Asia and Africa, of the sovereign First Nations on this continent. In a different register, I think of what Ray Gator said last week at the launch of his new book, that love of country is not going away anytime soon. For him, the question is whether it is possible to suck the poison out of that love of country. For nation to be disconnected from the state, from domination, to retain the love without the poison, we would need to recover styles of writing the nation that avoid congealing into something fixed, something that must be violently defended, a state, a home, a castle. Can we imagine an undefended nation? Can we imagine a minor form of artistic sovereignty, one that rejects the mythic self-made writer, responsible to no one but themselves? Can we write a minor rather than a major literature? Here we might return to Namley's invocation of writerly sovereignty. He says that it is closer in spirit to Bartleby's I Would Prefer Not To, or Stephen Daedalus's Non Serviam. If Bartleby, the eponymous scrivener in Herman Melville's story, is sovereign, he does not possess a sovereignty of a dominating kind. He does not command nor lay claim to space, quite the opposite. His mantra, I would prefer not to, is a mantra of negation, not of possession. The story ends when he fades into nothing. And Stephen is not the hero of Ulysses. The hero, if there is one, is Leopold Bloom. And he too is non-possessive, non-dominating, avoiding the patriotic machismo of his fellow citizens, of the citizen, the one-eyed barfly and neighbourhood hero. No, Bloom does not defend his castle. He is ecumenical, always willing to consider multiple sources of authority. In that sense, he achieves what Stephen aspires to, non serviam. Bloom does not serve, not because he has made himself king or poet genius, but because of his pluralism, his radical openness to others. So a minor literature could also be thought of as a literature in exile, where Odysseus returns home to exact terrible and bloody vengeance on Penelope's suitors. Bloom's homecoming is rather less heroic. He forgets his keys and has to jump a railing to get through the basement door. A minor Australian literature would reject the very idea of the great Australian novel. It would eschew greatness in heroism, and it would stop trying to make English at home in places already full of language. It would, on the contrary, unsettle English, make it recognise the competing claims of other languages upon this land. This is precisely what Alexis Wright does through her extraordinary prose, which escapes all categorization. She writes in Carpentaria, "A nation chants, but we know your story already." Wright thus rejects the nation, or at least she rejects the fantasy of assimilated unity. But as Janine Leanne argues, that rejection does not lead to fragmentation. Rather, Wright turns to something bigger than nation, country. And country is not nation or state or territory. It is, in Leanne's words, spirituality, genealogy, language, and the collective memories and oral histories of a people that connect us to past, present, and future. The rainbow serpent in Carpentaria leaves in its wake the thunder of tunnels collapsing. We can think of these collapsing tunnels as the crumbling of the national mythology, a clearing away that, in Leanne's words, opens up a space for thinking beyond the nation, to stories of our place, our people, that open up new ways of thinking about the nation itself. Now, Wright's turn to country is not available to those of us who are non-Indigenous. But I think that we still can open ourselves up to something beyond the forced unity of the Australian nation-state. We can open ourselves up to the plurality that is already here. The nation is always already many places and many peoples. Remember the many differences threatening to burst through the sutures of the Howard Murray preamble. Rather than stitching up the wound with a fantasy or retreating into a fixed identitarian route, a minor literature begins with a particular people and a particular place, but never makes the place or the people into something universal, a one into which all must assimilate. A minor literature allows differences to proliferate, intermingle, and interchange. Gitanjali Sri, an author writing in Hindi and past winner of the International Booker, juxtaposes the obsession with roots, with finding the prime root, the original root, with the banyan tree, whose roots grow, roots upon roots upon roots, sprouting from the branches and tendrils, hands and soil spreading out. The banyan knits away at its unique tapestry and will keep knitting away obsessively into newer and newer spaces. The minor artistic sovereignty I'm thinking of is much like this image of the banyan tree and its roots. We are all many-rooted, growing in and out of those around us. The nation, if it exists at all, exists in an even more complex tangle. Who can get to the origin of all those tendrils? And why would you bother? Immigrants and diasporic peoples are especially attuned to the minor possibilities within a major dominant language, living and thinking and writing as we do in a language that is not fully our own. For writers from such backgrounds, mastering the language cannot be the horizon of their literary ambitions. A minor literature is emphatically not a literature of masters or mastery. Instead, they should strive to remain strangers in this language. Ouyang Yu's recent story essay published in Overland, The Art of Excavating a Word or Character, a Minor Case Study, is a superb example of how to do this. On one level, it is the account of how Yu came to translate a poem by Taiwanese Chinese poet Li Chen into English. On another, it is a meditation on the impossibility of monolingualism. On another is a meditation on the impossibility of faithful translation. Still, on another level, it is a playful rebuke of Australian monolingualism. And in the end, Yu gleefully upends established notions of ownership. It is he, the former professor at Wuhan University, who manages the impossible act of translation through the excavation of a word. Your word, he says, an English one. That word, as it happens, is soldier. Li Chen's poem is made up of a single Chinese character, Bing, which means soldier. As the character is repeated over and over again, it slowly disintegrates, revealing the other characters hidden within it. From Bing, the character dissolves into Ping and then Chu. That is, the character for soldier disintegrates into the character for shooting, which dissolves into the character for mounds, as in burial mounds. Through his translation, Yu excavates a similar history in our word. Soldier disintegrates into the one who is sold, and then the one who dies. Ultimately, literature is as much, if not more, a matter of reading as it is of writing. If literature is always an invitation towards shared or collective imagining, then the reader does vital work. And each of these modes of writing I have been talking about comes with a mode of reading. The artist as sovereign citizen comes with habits of reading attuned to the monumental, always on the lookout for greatness. This is a mode of reading that seeks to make a major literature, one that belongs, that dominates in this landscape. These are readers forever putting writing into hierarchies of value, so that one book might be crowned the great Australian novel. The writing of identity comes with a paranoid style of reading. Is this text authentic? Is this other text offensive, racist, sexist? In contrast, reading for a minor literature proceeds contrapuntally through the counterpoint of major and minor. It is not a naive reading. It is a reading that is always on the lookout for that which has been forcibly excluded. But where it differs from the paranoid reading is that it doesn't use evidence of exclusion and repression to cancel the text or the author, but instead reads for what might be salvaged. Michelle de Kretzer writes of how she had never wholly recovered from Virginia Woolf's description in her diaries of two Ceylonese visitors working with her husband to end colonialism as persistent darkies. Forgetting, writes de Kretzer, is the precondition for time recovered, the Proustian truth. It's also the precondition for a form of kindness that we might extend to others and wish for ourselves. And this is the hopeful thing, that if we learn to read in this way, then a minor Australian literature is already here. Perhaps there is even something minor to be recovered from the so-called greats of the national canon. At least that is how I understand readings such as that performed by Christos Tsiolkas on Patrick White, a reading of abundant love and kindness that finds in the great national writer something of the outsider. Lee's reading of Malouf too is too an act of love. And I wonder if there is not, in all that Lee finds to love in Maloof, something with which to read Maloof against the grain of his own project of nation writing. In a very different register, Jessica Jean Mai Yu reads back the racist archive in her essay All the Stain is Tender. She rearranges the parliamentary debates about what would come to be known as the White Australia policy. Her rearrangement allows the Asian bodies that have been repressed to come through, so that the racist texts become a kind of minor poetry. Different again is de Kretz's Questions of Travel. She writes with a keen eye for the deadening of language, words killed off by everyday banalities, by corporate speak, by travel guide hyperbole, by state-sponsored domination. Against that deadening, de Kretzer has Ravi, a Sri Lankan asylum seeker, forced to give a consistent and coherent account of his reasons for fleeing. Dream instead of saying to the tribunal member, "You are making the same mistake I did. You are looking for clues and connections. What happened has no plot, it's only true." And then, looking at the coat of arms in the tribunal, the kangaroo and the emu, he thinks, "How ridiculous you look. Do you have a consistent story?" No. Of course, the nation-state does not have a consistent story. And it is the role of minor literature to show that, to strike down the consistent, coherent story offered up by major literature, to reject what Brian Castro calls the triumphalist model of Australian literature. He calls instead for a writing out or disinheritance, a break with literature as a monument to the nation-state. In place of a major triumphalist literature, we have to find ways of writing which express another possible community, one that acknowledges the reality of difference and plurality. We're on the home stretch now. I began by asking about the missing third term between writing and nation. That missing term is race. But as I've been showing, it keeps being erased. The idea of a minor literature that I have been discussing is a way of keeping the relationship between writing and nation and race in sight. It does so in a way that avoids the essentialism of identity politics. Just as the nation has no consistent story, no prime root, so too the self. Our identities are neither fixed nor completely free. Stuart Hall, the founder of cultural studies, put it well when he said of diasporic peoples that they bear the traces of particular histories and cultures. But while these traces form them, they also enable them to produce themselves anew and differently. This is a radically hopeful way of talking about the differences that have been made to signify race. Hall never forgets our histories of racial hierarchization and domination, but he is not pessimistic about those histories. They provide the seeds for reimagining identities and communities in new, more liberating ways. I think back to something Aziz said to us on The Messenger, a podcast comprising voice messages sent from Manus Island to Melbourne. Aziz is a Zagawa man from Sudan who was imprisoned on Manus by the Australian government for trying to arrive here by boats. In 2017, the government tried to wash its hands of responsibility for Aziz and the other refugees on the island by closing the prison and moving them into so-called transit accommodation. But the prisoners did an extraordinary thing. Instead of leaving, they took over the detention centre and ran it as an autonomous community for nearly a month, collecting rainwater and setting up solar panels for power. This is an example, an extreme but telling one, of that other possible community, of the undefended nation. A coming together that is contingent, never a justification for violence, and also never completed. This is community as an ongoing activity, an interlinking, intermingling of differences in mutual, fruitful, defiant, and joyous exchange. In the end, all literature helps to produce a community. I have attempted tonight to outline an idea of literature that helps to produce the kind of community I want to live in. One that includes Aziz and his comrades on Manus, the Taiwanese backpackers and their quest for small but certain happinesses, and all those who try to make a life, however precariously, in Australia. Of that time, after the official closure of the prison, Aziz said, 24 days we lived as a nation, and the only way I can describe it is that we were a nation. We were a country with 12 different nationalities. I like to think that this gives a sense of the possible role of a minor literature, a literature in exile, a literature of non-mastery, of disinheritance, that it can, for a time, show us how we might live together. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I always feel with these events, there's something, especially tonight, this sense of we've all got thoughts and questions. There is no Q&A. One of the good things about that is that you get to take that energy, that unresolved, how do we respond to this? How do we create and help foster what is already there, this minor Australian literature, and do with it and treat it and carry it forward. So I believe Andre has curated or selected some books so that you may want to browse through and perhaps purchase, but also I think his book will be there for sale as well. Thank you so much for being here tonight, and please put your hands together again for our two wonderful writers, Hasib Hirani and André Dao. Thank you.